the Chinese garden is celebrating chrysanthemums right now, and so we have a lovely display all around the garden and behind us. So what I'm going to talk about today is the medicinal use of chrysanthemum in Chinese medicine and how it's really used for longevity purposes and to benefit all around health and stress, de-stress and well-being. Yeah, do many of you guys drink teas often or use herbs in different ways? So you're familiar with the basic properties. So in Chinese medicine, there's a few different modalities that we use to treat the body, and one of them is herbal medicine. And so herbs tend to have different qualities contained within them to balance the different elements. And so in Chinese medicine, we have 5 elements that we talk about. And this one is fire. We have earth, metal, water, and wood. And so from those elements, most of our medicine derives out of it, actually. It's all broken into how these different movements of qi affect the body and affect well-being. And so when we talk about herbs, we're really talking about the wood element. And what do we think of when we think of wood? Like, what are y'all's associations with it? Does anybody have any?
Associations with wood, is that what you said?
Yeah, like when you think about wood as an elemental aspect, what would you think of?
Warm.
Warm. It can definitely generate heat. Yeah, it's movement and growth. You know, when you think about it, we look around at plants, trees, and nature, and how nature grows. And the movement of wood is about unmitigated growth. And within our body, it's that idea of creating an underlying qi flow that is consistent and free-flowing and moving so that we don't have imbalances exist. And so in Chinese medicine, wood is really the basis of the way in which we go about life through growth and development. It's about our ambitions, it's about our goals, it's also about vision. And so it's really how are we going about our path, you know? And what happens is that since it really wants to move outwards and just expand in all different directions, as daily life happens, especially stressors, emotional stress, trauma of different types, what happens is that energy gets blocked. And when moving energy gets blocked, it becomes stagnant and then it starts becoming agitated, right? And so oftentimes when we think about wood in Chinese medicine and that growth perspective, we also see that some of the imbalances that it includes can be like anger and irritability, and emotional, upset, just not being able to contain your emotions because there's that uneven ability for the wood to permeate through the system. And so when we talk about chrysanthemum, one of the main things that it does is it helps clear that heat that builds up. Somebody said heat that they associate with wood. Heat is when wood becomes imbalanced and it stays stagnant because it has all of that movement behind it. It can start generating heat. And what happens with heat is that it starts flaring up and out, right? When we think about fire, it tends to rise, so it goes up to the head, up to the eyes, up to this upper area of the body. So oftentimes red face can happen, red eyes. And when we look at chrysanthemum in Chinese medicine, the name for it is Ju Hua. So Hua means flower, and Ju is a homophone for 9, and so this is just the word for chrysanthemum, but oftentimes people associate it with the number 9 as well. Because Ju, another, like I said, it's a homophone, it sounds like the number 9 in Chinese medicine. And so one thing about chrysanthemum and the way that it's been used is traditionally there's a festival that's held on the 9th day of the 9th month of the Chinese calendar. this festival, actually this year, it would have happened on, I believe, November 12th-ish or so. Because you guys know that the Chinese calendar is different than the Western calendar. They go by lunar calendar. And usually their New Year tends to be, anywhere from the end of January to mid-February, sometimes later February. This last year it was, I believe, February 10th or somewhere around there. And so we just passed this 9th day of the 9th month. And in Chinese medicine, nines have a lot of correlation with that very yang movement energy as well. When I say yang, do you guys know what I'm talking about? Are you familiar with the basics of yin and yang? Or do you want me to go over it a little bit?
How would you be using it in this context?
So in underlying everything is the basic principles of yin and yang, oftentimes, with the yin and yang symbol, what we call the Tai Chi symbol. And so what it means is that in everything that we look at, there's going to be the solid, the cool, the stable aspect, and then there's going to be the movement aspect. And so when I'm talking about yang in this context, it's about that movement aspect. And so what happens, especially during this time of the year, what you'll notice in the seasons is that we went from summer, which was very active, very yang in nature. There was a lot of warmth, there was a lot of activity. Things are just moving quicker at that time. There just tends to be more yang in the environment. But what happens around this time of the year is that yang is changing to yin, right? We're getting into that cool season, the wet season. It's going to start getting maybe even frozen as winter comes in, which is the basis of the yin. That's the most yin aspect of the year. And so what happens in the 9th month on the 9th day is that yang transition to yin. And so a lot of times this is when yang disorders might come up a little bit because we're supposed to be transitioning to a more quiet time, a more stable time. But if yang is in disorder, it doesn't want to calm down. And so that's why Juhua or chrysanthemum is used oftentimes during this year, because it's really good at helping calm that heat and drain that fire that might be a little agitated during this time of year. And if you look in the environment, I'm not sure, but I work with a lot of people, I work with a lot of students and clients as well, and a lot of people are feeling very agitated right now over the last few weeks, and part of it is that transitionary time when yang is trying to settle. And so that's why, if you guys want to grab some Juhua, there's some chrysanthemum tea back there, but it's really good to drink, especially during this time of year. And so when we're talking about 9 on 9, because 9 is symbolic of the most yang, right? It's kind of the highest number before we start having to combine the lower numbers. And so it's about that peak of transition, that peak of yang. And during that time, like I said, that's when the yin needs to start coming in. So it's really good just to help your body through that transition, especially if there's a little bit of an imbalance. Does that make sense for everybody? Is there any questions about that? Great. And so Juhua on its own, like I said, it works on draining the heat from the top of the body. The other way that heat is seen in Chinese medicine, there's two aspects of it. One is the physiological aspect, so we need heat. We need this underlying metabolism in our body to keep our processes going. It's just part of the function of things. And wood has that natural movement as well. And so wood and fire are considered more of the yang elements, the ones that are more associated with the movement, and they tend to go up. And so when either of those is imbalanced, like I said, you'll start having different symptoms, especially in the face and the head. It also has a lot to do with emotions. Like I said, anger is a big part of this disorder, irritability, and sometimes if you think about it, it's that need for something to get out, and finally it just bursts through. And that's the idea of wood as well. And so throughout your life, wood imbalance is one of the things that will, in the long run, drain a lot of your underlying energies. And so they really do a lot in Chinese medicine to help regulate the liver and the wood element. I don't think I introduced that yet, but so wood, you guys get wood as a concept of the element. So in our body, the organ that's associated with that is the liver. And in Western medicine, we'll see that the liver does help store blood, it processes blood. It also helps the function of the gallbladder with digestion as well. And that is how we see it in Chinese medicine as well. We have a little bit more ideas of its basic underlying functions, but it does correlate a lot with our knowledge of it. And one of the things, because it is wood, it is responsible for that movement of qi, for the smooth movement so that we don't have these imbalances. And the liver, it corresponds with different aspects of the body, but one of the main ones is the eyes. And the idea of clear vision has a lot of symbolism in Chinese medicine, and it has a lot to do with long life and longevity and health. It's also about the clarity of the mind. And so in Chinese medicine, there's a lot of things that you'll see that are about clearing the eyes, making the eyes bright. Because when the eyes are bright, the spirit is bright, and the spirit is functioning, and it's coming to the world and meeting it appropriately. If the eyes aren't bright, then something's going on. Either the qi isn't flowing correctly, or some of the processes, maybe the functions are going down, maybe the spirit or the shen is a little clouded, or something might be going on. So one of the main things that Juhua is said to do is brighten the eyes. And it's that idea of helping the movement of the qi and draining the fire at the same time so that the clarity can come out. The other idea with the brightened eyes is clarity of vision, both physical and more in the ethereal or mind aspect as well. How do we plan our lives? What kind of perspective do we have on things? And this is all shown by the brightness of the eyes in Chinese medicine. And so Juhua is oftentimes used for that function. Does that make sense for everybody? So drink Juhua a lot. One of the basic longevity teas in Chinese medicine is Juhua combined with gochitsa. Have you guys heard of goji berries or wolfberries? Yeah, it's called a couple different things, but it's a really common tonifying and longevity herb as well in Chinese medicine. And so their idea is that one thing that we need to do is keep the fire in check, keep that yang nature at bay so that it's really working functionally and not overdoing itself and draining things in the long run. And that's what the Juhua does. And then the gochitsa, that actually helps tonify the blood aspect of things, and it helps tonify the water aspect. Are you familiar with how the 5 elements work at all? How they generate one another? I'll go over it really quick for those that aren't. So we already talked about wood and the nature of wood. What you'll see is there's 2 basic ways of drawing the 5 elements from more of like a symbolic understanding of how they work together. So this is the most typical way, and this is how we look at this outside circle here is called the generating cycle. And so it's how we see in nature that different movements of qi and different aspects of elements generate one another. So if we think about it, wood creates fire. And that makes sense because oftentimes we need something substantive like wood to burn, right? So in a very physical sense, we burn wood to create fire. And then once that aspect has happened and fire has burnt the wood, it returns back to earth, right? It becomes the dust and it generates that more yin aspect because all of the yang, the fire, has now left and now it has become the earth. So then the earth, if we think about earth and metal, there's 2 different ways of looking at this, and this is one of the more confusing, I think, for Western mindsets to understand because of our association with these terms. But there's 2 ways. One is that when we look at the earth, different areas, especially in the depths of the earth, in caves and other areas, you have these mineral deposits being created, right? Just from the condensation of the earth. So it's the depths of the earth that creates these other types of minerals. So metal is often seen as associated with minerals. Obviously, metal mountains are another way of looking at metal. One of the other things that metal is associated with, the other way of looking at it, is the sky. And so metal in our medicine is the lungs. And if you think about it, the lungs are how we breathe in from the sky. And so in our body, the lungs take on the same usage as the sky does and the functionality when we look at the earth. So one of the ways this is seen as well is like clouds and that condensation in the sky of, the rising steam from the earth, and it contains it. And I like that way because then it helps us understand how it brings water. And so once metal contains enough of that natural steam, then it becomes clouds and it rains back down to the earth, right? The other way of looking at it from the metallurgy type of view is that we have minerals, stone, metals that we can make containers with, right? Because water needs to be contained. It's very hard to hold water without a container. And so that's the other way of looking at metal and how it contains in its nature. And then water is associated with obviously what we see around us. But what's nice about water is if you look, there's so many different ways that it works, right? There's the very stable water that, like the lakes and the depths of the ocean, and then there's the rushing water of the streams. The basic nature of water is that it tends to flow downwards and it tends to be so powerful that in the long run it will get past all obstacles, right? The power of water and the power of yin is something that we often talk about in Chinese medicine, especially because what we were talking about before with the yang nature being something that can in the long run harm the body if it's not in check. That yin nature, that yin quality of water is really used to keep the yang at bay and in check and nourished. And so then we look at water, and water creates wood, right? Because plants need wood, or wood needs water, or plants need water to grow. And if you don't have water, one of the, especially when it comes to, what we're talking about today with the Juhua and the access of working on the liver, we need that liver, we need that wood to be pliable, like a young sapling. When trees first grow, they're very movable. It's very hard to break them, right? Those green branches. But as they get older and things start to expand out and they grow more, the flow stops nourishing as much as it should. And that's one of the functions of the liver, is to nourish all the way to the extremities and back. And as we get older, the function starts decreasing. So we start having, poor circulation in our hands. Some people even start getting numbness, and that's that ability of the liver to nourish out to the extremities. And so if we look at that in the ways of how we see wood and trees, as they get bigger, the branches start being easier to break off, right? And in the long run, that is what can lead to a degradation of the system. So what we're looking at in Chinese medicine is how do we keep the fire in check and how do we keep the water nourished? That's the basic ideas of things. And that's why Juhua is considered a very powerful herb. It's nice because it's very mild, and that's it. They use a lot of very mild, almost food-grade herbs so that you can use them consistently, so that you can have them as part of your diet without having to worry about, any type of contraindications or not needing to use it at different times. Like there's nothing really about it, but it just has this natural low-level quality of keeping things at bay and in check. And then, like I said, together with gochitsa or goji berries. And the goji berries help that water aspect, right? So that's why if you can work on both sides of things and really work on things balanced, then in the long run you'll have longevity and you'll have these processes that can continue going because they're not using each other's resources. Does that make sense for everyone? Any questions about it or anything? Okay, so one thing I wanted to talk about too, with this idea in mind, is that I can go in two different ways. Do you guys want me to explain the inner circle here, or do you want to go into the seasonal correspondences?
Let's do the inner circle.
Okay. So I talked about this outer one being about generation, right? And so this is how the elements generate one another. So one of the other ways that we look at things is how do things keep each other in check, right? Because if it just constantly generated on itself, it would eventually just be so much itself that it wouldn't really work in a process with other things. And so this one inside is called the controlling cycle. Now, oftentimes elements, especially in our culture, we have a little bit of a bad connotation with controlling. We tend to think of it as not the best thing. And so another way that I like to look at this is refinement. So we need these other elements to refine the elements that they control or work on. And if we start with water, because that's the season that we're entering, so it's really important to understand the qualities of water, because during this time we really want to cultivate them so that throughout the year they're not going to be as taxed, right? So water controls fire. And how do we understand that? That's a pretty easy one to see, right? That's, when a fire happens, the best thing to do, well, sometimes is throw water on it. Sometimes maybe not. But in nature, we see how the coolness of the seasons, the wet rain can come in and really help disperse the heat and help the heat cool down. And so this is a very important part of our understanding of health and longevity in the long run, is this balance between fire and water. And once again, that's what Juhua really helps with, is keeping that fire at bay so that the water doesn't have to work so hard, because the water is working hard all the time. The water is considered our base ability to go, our will, and as we get older, definitely a lot of people start coming down with things such as adrenal fatigue. Have you heard of that? And that's kind of where you're burning the wick at both ends for so long that in the long run your body just can't do it anymore. And that's part of the water as well, is draining the water, that constantly needing to go and constantly needing to do things. Because the water is all about stillness and being able to just sit and be, and that's what helps nourish the water as well in our medicine. And then if we look at fire, like we talked about, that's the yang nature, that's that movement outwards. And so it's really about that balance. And here as well, you can see that they're one of the base polarities in Chinese medicine that we work with all the time, is this balance of fire and water. Because we need the fire to help metabolize and make the water usable, right? Because if the water just sits, like I'm from Florida, there's a lot of marshland, and it doesn't lend to a lot of life. It lends to certain types of life, but it's stagnant. What we need is that moving water to really be healthy and to work through the system and nourish the areas that it needs to go. And what we need for that is the yang nature, the movement of fire, because the yin nature of water on its own would just sit. So it really needs that activity. But on the other hand, if things become too active, that's where we start burning our resources and start using things too much. So we need that water to keep that fire in check. So they work back and forth like that. So then we look at the next part of the inner star. So we call this the star in a circle for obvious reasons. And so the fire controls metal. How would we maybe understand that, just from what we see in our lives?
What makes it live?
Exactly.
You think of foundries and the big burning in the metal?
Exactly, yeah. Because if we look at metal, like metal ore, any types of metal, it's not really usable unless we add this fire element to it, right? Like we said, we need it to be pliable so that we can make it into tools, make it into containers. We use metal for so many things about structure. Metal is really about structure. But if metal becomes too rigid, then it becomes unpliable and really unfunctional. So we need that fire aspect of things to keep that metal pliable and porous, so that it doesn't become too rigid in any particular way, and contain the system so that it no longer takes in or gives out. So that's one of the ways that fire works with metal. And then metal with wood, what about that?
Shapes it.
Exactly. So, one of the basic ways of looking at it is the use of axes to take down trees. We use our tools to make the nature around us into something that we can use. And that's a way that metal helps to refine wood. And then in that sense as well, when we talk about the nature of the wood to just spread, if it just continues spreading, then nothing would ever come back in, right? And that's how oftentimes we see that natural inclination of movement can slowly drain the underlying resources, because if nothing's coming in replenishing that, then eventually it will just end, right? And so the metal's ability to contain things helps keep that wood in check as well. And then so for wood and earth, anybody have any ideas about that one?
metabolizes the earth,
In what way?
and that it uses the earth and its elementals to regenerate itself
Exactly. Yeah. And if we look at it, what are you
and
going
fertilization.
to say? Yeah, definitely. And one of the ways that I like to look at this too is if you look at land next to water, you know, it gets eroded very quickly unless there's trees to hold it there, right? So the earth is stabilized by that wood as well. So one thing is that the wood helps metabolize the water and the nutrients and helps keep the earth functional so that it doesn't just sit and become unusable, right? It's also that idea of tilling the earth. You know, when we have earth on its own, it may not actually grow things. It may not actually be functional until we till it, you know, until we break it up and make it to where we can actually plant something in it, right? So it's really about that movement of the earth because earth on its own can tend towards stagnation. You know, people who have earth dispositions, they can tend to get cluttered and have a hard time moving out of things, you know, and in the Northwest here, it's good to realize because dampness affects the Earth's ability to do that. And it's a very damp place up here. So a lot of times people have this issue with the Earth of that movement, you know, and really needing to use that yang natural movement of the wood energy to work with the Earth and make it more usable. And so then the Earth with water, how do we think about that one? How does the Earth control water? Exactly. So if we look at it, there's a saying from the Neijing, there's some classic books that we use in our medicine that have given us the basis for all of our knowledge in our medicine. And one of the things that's said, they talk about it with organs, but I'll talk about it with elements because that's what we're talking about. But they say that water is the gate for earth and earth is the gate for water. Right? So they have this reciprocal relationship as well, where once again, if we look at earth, think about the desert. If we look at earth on its own, it's not functional, right? It can't provide life-giving nourishment unless we have that water contained within it. And then on the other hand, water on its own doesn't have any form. It's not usable until the banks of the river, until the earth comes up and forms it. You know, so they help actually form the ways in which both of them work and flow. And so oftentimes we think of this as like damming up rivers, you know, creating resources out of the water that we may not have if it's just flowing on its own. So it's a way to really help structure the water for our own usage as well. And then, then we went into water and fire. Good. Anybody have any questions about any of that? It makes sense to everyone? Great. And so going into the seasonal aspect of things, I talked a little bit about it. Let me just double check the time real quick. Oh, perfect. So what we see here is, in general, because fire is yang in nature, we tend to think of it as being at the height of things, right? The upper part of our body. During the seasons, what season would it correspond to?
Summer.
Exactly. Yeah, the summer, the sun is in the middle of the sky, right? It's the most yang time. There's a lot of heat. And in nature, what type of things do we see in the summer?
Blooms.
Exactly. So that's where the flowers are at their height of existence, right? Everything in spring they start blooming. But in fire and in summer is when everything is at its peak of existence, right? And this is why summer is thought to have so many, qualities that really help the movement of qi and really express things on the largest scale. And so the emperor in traditional China, his seat is faced to the south, right? It's faced towards the sun, because that's the idea is that we want to have that yang nature through the majority of our life. And so in our formative years, or pretty much from the 20s to sometimes people's 70s and 80s, that's that fire aspect, right? That's where we're really walking in the world and expressing ourselves. And so in summer, we tend to see the blooms, right? So flowers are really important. We This is also when, the babes, the young ones that were born in spring are starting to get a little bit of maturity. They start looking like adolescents. You'll start seeing them take on more of their own responsibilities just in nature around us. What types of foods tend to be in the summer?
Melons.
We have some melons, which,
Fruit.
yeah, and especially like watermelons.
Vegetables.
Mhm. Yeah, all this abundance, right? So there's a lot of things going because, yeah, there's all this expression of all the seeds that have been planted and nourished throughout the rest of the year are now coming to their fruition, right? And so when we talk about, eating with the seasons in regards to how to keep things in balance, nature produces its remedies on its own, right? And so the things that are present during summer actually help cool the fire. Like a lot of times in Chinese medicine, we use those watermelon rinds and the different melon rinds to cool things. And they're very good at helping drain the fire, especially down through the urination. So during summer, really look at what's around you and take those in, because if we're eating heavy, hot foods during summer, it doesn't really help balance that natural nature of fire, right? We want to add cooling elements. We also want to eat pretty lightly. In Chinese medicine, it's kind of frowned on to eat raw vegetables because it makes our digestion work too hard. So, it's just in the long run, we feel like if you're constantly working to have to cook it yourself, that it's just going to drain the fire a little bit more than you want. So we always say at least a light steam. Sometimes people cook it to mush, so their stomach doesn't have to work very hard at all. But during this time, this is the one time where the yang nature around us actually helps that function. So during this time, salads are appropriate, because it does help cool that natural fire anyway. And so this is when it's in Chinese medicine, it's better to do things such as fast or really light diets, juicing. It's better to do it over summer, because during the other times of the year, when you don't have that natural availability of yang, it can tax your system a little bit too much. So that's the idea of summer. And then metal, that's the time that we're kind of, at the tail end. In a lot of times in our culture, the way that we look at the seasons is by the equinoxes and the solstices, But in Chinese medicine, those are actually the middle of the seasons. They're not the start and the end. And so right now, in between the equinox and the solstice, is when we're coming into this water from this metal, right? So we just went out of metal. So what time frame is metal for? What season? Exactly. And so during this time, what kind of foods do we see?
Apples.
So this is like the harvest season, right? So this is when,
Root vegetables.
yeah, exactly. We've got root vegetables, potatoes, berries even in that middle, like in between summer and fall. It's really about taking in the abundance of summer. So what has summer brought us? And now we need to take it in and store it for the rest of the season, right? Because when winter comes, there are some vegetables that grow during that time, but for the most time, food is a little bit more scarce, in the natural world for people and animals during the winter. So fall is all about that time of containing and taking things in and keeping it. It's almost kind of like thinking of filling up the silo so that winter you have plenty of food to work with. And so during this time, root vegetables are some of the best things, that really helps your body become hardy so that it can last through the winter. And also the way that we tend to cook root vegetables, we steam them and we cook them down so they're usually very soft and very easy for our body to digest. And so it's very healthy in that way as this yang is declining, just to help that underlying process of the digestion. The other thing that you'll see with fall too is that a lot of times it's associated with dryness and wind. This is when people start getting colds because the wind starts moving more. And so the other idea with fall is that you really want to contain your qi, or your vital essence, and Scarves are huge. Always have a scarf on. Anytime, as soon as that wind starts, right as summer dips, you should just have a scarf around your neck, and you'll actually be surprised at how healthy you stay because there's something about it. Wind comes and opens things up, and it kind of makes us feel a little sick and allows for other things to come in. And so fall is during that time when we need to be really aware of containing that aspect of ourselves, or we're going to be susceptible to this invasion of wind and therefore sickness. And then with winter, what type of things do we see in winter, especially in the environment and nature?
Resting.
Exactly. So hibernation, a lot of animals go into hibernation during this time. The other thing that we see is that this is when everything is at its lowest peak of life, right? So everything that's going to be reborn in the spring is pretty dormant during the winter. And that's how we should be as well. The idea of health in Chinese medicine is really about doing things in natural rhythms so that you're not going against the natural flow of the energy. And so during winter, I think we have a society that tends to be very go, 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 and people just continue that on throughout the seasons without really thinking about that. But in the long run, that's what's going to drain you, and there's going to be a lot of decline in function in the long run. And so what's nice is that during this time, and this 9/9 ceremony actually happens right in the middle of this transition, right? And that's when that total decline of yang, because it has been at its peak, now everything is going into the yin. And during this time, it's best, I don't know if you can really do this in modern life, but it's best to raise with the sun and go to bed with it. So you might be up for 6 hours sometimes, depends on where you live. But it is that idea of really being to yourself, being inside, not having too many activities, because activities during this time can really just deplete that natural resource. And then with foods, we see some foods, but not too many. Like I said, this is really a time where hopefully we have prepared well enough and stored food so that this time where there's less abundance, we can make it through without going too far into our reserves or depleting our reserves. Does that make sense for everybody? And then this wood aspect here is obviously going to be spring, right? And with what we talked about with wood earlier, how would you think about that with spring? That movement, that energy, and why it relates to spring? Exactly. So during this time is when we see the new growth, right? This is when we see the babies in nature. Baby trees, baby saplings, baby birds, baby bees. And it's that movement of as life is coming up, right? Everything is growing during this time. And all that it wants to do, if you look at anything in its infancy and as it's moving through those stages, it just wants to grow and it just wants to explore and move outwards. And so during that time, that's when things should be starting to wake up again. You should be starting to do more activities and really looking at how that affects us around us. And the other idea too is that we see this also correlating with directions. And so I talked a little bit about how fire is seen as being south, and they have a little bit different relationship with how they put their map because they think of south and yang as being the upward movement, so they put south towards the top of their map. And it's just that idea of it being the yang nature. And that's because the sun tends to be in the south most, as it declines towards the south, and then as it comes up from the south until it's to the center. That's just the natural movement of the sun. So the southern side tends to be more light in general. And then fall is going to be west, and spring is going to be east, and then winter is going to be north. And then if we look at winter being in the north, it makes a lot of sense. That's where things tend to be colder in most regions. Obviously, this is a northern hemisphere perspective, but that's where China is, and that's where we are, so it makes sense. How, in your understanding of things, can you maybe think about why spring would be with the east and fall would be with the west?
Probably the turning of the earth.
And the sun, right? So if we think about it, if throughout life we're supposed to be facing south, then to our left is the rising sun, you know, and then to the right is the west and the setting sun. So it's those ideas here too, that birthing, you know, that movement of the day that, you know, and every day it's the sunbreak, and then this is the sunset. And so it's just putting all of those correlations with the way in which chi moves around us, right? Because it all just breaks down to these basic movements, and then if we can start seeing how they come out in these different aspects, we can start noticing them in different areas of our life, you know, and you'll just start making those different correlations.
In many cultures, the front door is facing east.
Oh yeah, and that's perfect, right? Just help start your day and a good movement. Yeah, especially in China, there's a lot with feng shui, you know, which is the basic arrangement of your house and the environment or things within your house. Yeah, and it has those principles as well. It's like you want to generate that energy, right? It's all about, that's what sustains the movement of life and our goals. And once again, like we talked about with Juhua helps us with that. You know, it helps with that basic movement of the spring energy in the wood. And then the last one is earth. And so earth is seen as being the center to everything, right? Because this is earth. We have an earth-based perspective. That's really what everything that we know of manifests through. All of these things are only tangible through earth, right? And so earth holds the center for all of the other elements. When it's talked about seasonally, there's two different ways of looking at it. One is that some people consider it like the Indian summer aspect, so that late summer that kind of extends a little further, hopefully, each year. And what kind of environment do we see during that late summer period? What is
Fall
that?
summer.
What'd you say?
Fall summer.
Exactly. Yeah. And what do you mean by that? Like, what's the environmental quality?
Well, up north here, of course, is, well, where I'm from in Montana, it's like the reprieve before the dark.
Totally. Yeah, and so you have that heat of the summer that's lasting into fall, but because fall is starting to really bring in those yin qualities, yeah, so you have this weird summer, you know, and what we correlate it with in Chinese medicine is that damp heat quality. You know, and I'm from Florida, and it's damp heat central, and so it's like, I always think about that as being everywhere else is Indian summer, you know, but it really has kind of that heavy heat quality to it, because things are starting to decline and go into the yin nature, but there's still this remnant of the fire and the summer left, right? And then also if we look at our body is considered to be the earth element, obviously, like our flesh is the earthly embodiment of all of these other elements. And then, you know, there's a lot of different associations throughout the body with the elements, but the basis is that our body, it tends to, you know, without water, earth is not functional, right? We already talked about that. But because earth needs water, it tends to accumulate it as well, which in the long run can not allow the function of the earth to be as good as we would want it to be. And so that's the other idea of that. One other way of looking at the season for the earth, there's a couple different ways I've heard it, which I really like. One is that it's the most harmonious days of the year, right? Because earth is all about harmony. So it's those days in between the seasons where you're like, this is perfect. You know, the sun is out, it's a little warm, but it's a little cool. So those really harmonious days are also thought to be correlated with the earth, and sometimes that's seen as the last 15 days of each season. So it's that transition between the seasons can also be correlated with earth because everything transforms through earth. So that's another way of looking at it.
I love those periods.
I know. That's why, yeah, it's all about pleasure too. That's what I love about earth. It's like the sensual pleasures of just enjoying things, right? Yeah, good. Does anybody have any questions or have any questions, you know, want to know more about?
Seems like the transition between fall and winter often is harder than between winter and spring.
Exactly.
And some of that might be, for some people, not all people,
Yeah.
is that there's more of a looking forward in spring than fall. It's like, oh man, it's shutting down, you know.
Exactly. And it's
Unless
really
you're a
hard.
skier.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Like what seasons do you flourish in? You know, that's another really interesting thing, is just to look at your own dispositions. Do you like it better when it's hot? Do you like it better when it's cold? Because if we
I like the distinctions. I like the fact that seasons still no reasons to change.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
I embrace all of them.
I'm the same way, and that's an earth disposition. It's like, let's just do this and really enjoy it, you know, enjoy what each piece has to bring.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But it's interesting just to see how your basic constitution too, you know, if you run cold, winters can be really hard. And it's because that fire, that underlying metabolism and nature of our body is already a little declining. And so during winter, it's going to be taxed even more. And oftentimes that's when we see deaths occur, because it's that time of returning back. You know, it's when the yin starts, becomes very solid. And if the yang isn't strong enough, then you know, it can go into the next stage, which is how we look at the water as well, as like returning back to the origin. You know, it's the sage aspect. So it's that later part in life where you just trust things more and you're just more comfortable with things because, yeah, you've been through the processes. You know, so it's and that's why water in the long run is important to cultivate. It's all about trusting the natural flow of things. You know, and for most of our years, we tend to fight that, and that's what can drain the water, you know, because we really need to just allow things to go. One of the emotions associated with water in this time of winter is fear. You know, there's fear of lack of abundance, fear of resources, fear of isolation and being alone. There's a lot of different fears that come up for people during this time. And so the best way to combat fear is with trust, you know, just understanding that there will be spring again. And things will come back, and there's that natural renewal process. But that's honestly why I think a lot of people have that hard time with that transition, is because metal is also all about that time of cutting away what no longer served us. You know, we reaped what we could take in, but now there's all of this other growth that needs to be taken away so that we can plant the seeds that will come up in spring again, right? And if we don't do that, and if we don't take care of that during that natural season in our lives and yearly, you know, what happens is it becomes cluttered, and then the growth of spring, yeah, and we all know how it, like, you know, we start seeing it in our lives, and it's like, okay, I need to get rid of stuff, but it's so hard because, yeah, you know, so many people have a hard time just really letting go, and that's what this season is all about.
True.
You know, but yeah, that's why I think that transition is harder for a lot of people in a lot of ways. Definitely.
Does, in the spring, you wouldn't use the chrysanthemum tea as much, but is the peony tea, how do you play that?
Yeah, Baishao is amazing. So Jupla is a season-long love affair. It's a beautiful herb just to drink throughout the year, mainly because when we need our fire to be resolved during this time, it's really good for helping that. But also during the spring, when the natural rise of yang is tending towards those imbalances, it's great to use it during that time too. And that's what's amazing about this medicine, is there's this balancing function. You know, it's not really, I only do this one thing. It's about keeping things in harmony, you know. So yeah, but Baishao is amazing. White peony is, it's very good for soothing the liver as well. It can also help tonify like the substance of the liver or the blood. So it's that yin nourishing quality, that water aspect of the liver that we were talking about. And so especially together with Juhua, because Juhua really helps brighten the yang nature of the liver, and then that Baishao can help the substantive aspect, so to keep that flowing and that clear yang to the eyes.
Is this the flower or the root?
It's the flower.
It's the flower.
Yeah.
And it's a certain type of mum?
Yeah, the ones that we tend to use look really similar to these guys here. They're the smaller, more round ones.
Probably more non-hybridized.
Right,
by
exactly.
humans
The ones that we
for
use
ornamental.
are more yellowish
Uh-huh.
in nature. You can get them, you know, they sell them in a lot of different places anyway that has like a bulk area, tends to have chrysanthemums. But yeah, they're just a little dried flower aspect, and we do use other parts of the plant, but the way that we look at flowers, if we think about their nature, you know, they're very soft. Like, we love flowers, but they're also very embodying of that yang nature of growth, but soft as well. And so that's why a lot of times flowers can have that softening nature, and they work a lot on lifting things, making things a little lighter, and then that spreading and opening of the eyes, and that growth nature out toward the environment. Yeah, and so that's why flowers are used a lot. They oftentimes help the eyes as well. There's a few correlations like that, but in general, they're just kind of good feeling herbs. Any other questions about any of this? Or anything that you guys wanted to ask? No?
It should go on forever and ever.
Oh, thank
That's not
you.
gonna work.
Yeah, let me just double check the time. Yeah, so we just have about 10 minutes, and so if there's no more questions, thank you. It was great
Thank
talking
you.
to you. Yeah. Yeah, this stuff is just really fun to just kind of delve into, you know, and then seeing how it plays out in our life.
So I missed the very beginning about probably explaining the different teas. Is that the name of the tea that you were just?
Yeah, the Juhua is the Chinese name for chrysanthemum.
Okay,
Mhm.
all right,
And so
okay.
the talk was mostly based around the function of chrysanthemum in
Okay.
Chinese medicine, because during this time they celebrate chrysanthemum as being very healing for this time in the year. Yeah, and there's some back there if you'd like some.
I think I will.
It's great. Yeah, nice meeting you. I'm glad that you got to make it. I like your
Thank you.
jacket.
Great.